When I was a little kid, I would walk into the living room almost every day and see my dad sitting in his normal chair reading a book. He would do this so often and consistently that one day I became interested in finding out what he was reading. When I went to his room and found his books, I remember many of them having the name Stephen King written across the top in big letters. Fast forward to 2017, when I was at the movie theater going to watch the premiere of the movie It. The movie was terrifying in my opinion, one of the first horror movies to scare me in a little while. I walked out of the theater and saw one of the posters for the movie. The name Stephen King was on it. I then realized that this movie was an adaptation of his novel. Every few years, another adaptation of his would come out, making me more intrigued as to who this man is. I decided to do this presentation on Stephen King because I wanted to know more about this author that my dad was very interested in. The King of Horror is an undeniably bold title to be given to such a broad genre of creativity. The man that bears this title is the one and only Stephen King. Author of tens of bestsellers and visionary for the horror genre itself, King is one of the only authors that has the achievements and credibility required to hold this title. Readers and critics alike look at all these successes and wonder, how was he able to attain this feat of acknowledgement? Where did this marvelous inventive ability of his arise? How does he think of such horrific ideas to create these mind-bending, grotesque, innovative, and highly appraised stories? In order to find out, a deep dive must be taken into the history of his beginning as an author and an intellectual, particularly looking into the authors and works that influenced him throughout his career, and in turn, the authors and creations that he influenced. King was born on September 21st, 1947, in Portland, Maine. When he was little, his father abandoned him and the rest of his family, consisting of his older brother David King and his mother, Nellie Ruth Pillsbury King. This fact is too important to go unmentioned and was undoubtedly a huge impact on his life. But I will specifically be focusing on author work and work influence only. King grew up at a time when written horror was frequently in the form of pulp fiction magazines. These magazines usually featured a front cover design with beautiful women being harassed by, not really, terrifying monsters. The purpose of this cover is to catch the eye of young readers and get them interested in reading these scary stories with beautiful women. These cruel, barbaric monsters and graphic scenes were also a staple of these relatively short-lived magazines. The actual makeup of these stories, however, was quite controversial because many critics at the time did not approve of this type of literary horror. Gary Homestead mentions on page 3 of his book titled Critical Insights, Stephen King, quote, lingering in a ghetto of hostile literary criticism and enduring the scorn of many critics who viewed the pulp genre as subliterate or adolescent and undeserving of serious attention, end quote, when referring to pulp fiction horror at the time. The critical disapproval might have been a result of a lack of what critics would say is proper literature in horror genre. However, King and many other kids his age were obviously unaffected by the critical dislike of these magazines and continued to find entertainment when they were still popular. These creepy tales were not the only written influence on King before most of his writing career. Modernism was a popular style of writing that, as stated by the University of Toledo, is, quote, writers in general rebelled against clear-cut storytelling and formulaic verse from the 19th century. Instead, many of them told fragmented stories which reflect the fragmented state of society during and after World War I, end quote. However, this style of writing started to become less common soon after the year King was born. Nonetheless, it is still seen in some of King's biggest influences, the most prominent of which being H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was an author whose scientific fantasy horror publications were released before King was even born. However, his work became much more popular over time, thus exposing King to his work with a little bit of lucky timing. King just happened to stumble across one of Lovecraft's works when he was young with the help of his brother. An article titled The Man That Can Scare Stephen King writes a quote from King. He says, quote, Lovecraft opened the way for me, and greatest practitioner of the classic horror tale, end quote, referring to Lovecraft, of course. The extremely popular movie critic website, Screen Rant, also points out how many of King's works show similar aspects of the work of Lovecraft. The one they specifically mention is how Pennywise from the movie It, in other words, is, quote, basically a Lovecraft monster, end quote. Given this is not really King's work, rather an influence of his work, but the backgrounds are still the same in both the writing and film. This is only one instance, and it occurs frequently within King's works. H.P. Lovecraft is such a big influence on King But there are other authors that should be mentioned as well. As pointed out in the previously mentioned book, Critical Insights, Stephen King, these authors all have publications that appeared in the pulp fiction magazines titled Weird Tales. These authors are Clark Ashton Smith and Robert Bloch. Clark Ashton Smith was a colleague of Lovecraft and had a little bit of a different approach to his storytelling, focusing on more alien adventure and creative world settings rather than direct grotesque horror. Smith is known, however, for his wonderful vocabulary and also his ability to create a wonderful and interesting creatures in his stories, the second of which is Robert Bloch, who is also a part of Weird Tales. Next is Richard Matheson. He is also an extremely important influence on King. Matheson, like the others, also finds himself in genres such as sci-fi and horror. Matheson wrote many extremely popular books such as I Am Legend, Hell House, The Shrinking Man, and many more. His books were able to reach his audience in a more effective way by relating their everyday lives and by relating to their everyday lives and also attacking their senses with an odd and uncanny aspects to his writing. King was a fan of his work and even said after Matheson's death, quote, "He fired my imagination by placing horrors not in European castles and Lovecraftian universes, but in American scenes that I knew and could relate to." End quote. In this quote, it almost appears that King is not fond of Lovecraft, but that is not the case. He is simply appreciating the difference between all three of them, including his own writing style and way of interpreting stories. As a result of these influences and many others, King has developed his own style of writing that also applies certain aspects of each of these writers. Publishing 60 plus novels and an even larger number of short stories is an impressive feat that Stephen King has accomplished by writing so consistently and quickly throughout the years. The book titled Threads by my teacher, Dr. Milky, mentioned King's three different types of horror. The first being gross out, which is the easiest and most common type of horror used in writing and also film. Gross out is when the author appeals to what the audience might be disgusted by, such as a smashed body or a rotting monster. The second of which is horror. Horror is the objectively scary aspects, such as a terrifying large monster or a ghost with no head. Lastly, there is terror, which is arguably the scariest one in my opinion. Terror attacks your senses and makes you feel an extreme sense of uneasiness and fear. Terror can resonate from the unknown or even the uncanny. King uses a combination of these three aspects to create his novels. The terror of the unknown world outside the grocery store eats away at the characters in his novel The Mist. The horror created by a terrifying clown Pennywise is an example of his novel It. The grossness of the man in Gerald's game makes his readers want to grimace as they continue to read. It is also common it is also a common opinion among readers of King novels that his characters are very impactful and well-rounded, which amplifies the effect of his novels. It should also be mentioned that King is not limited to strictly horror. He also wrote Shawshank Redemption, which holds its own and is very popular amongst readers. The culmination of all of these things has provided King with the perfect formula for writing. Since King has so much success with his writing style, it is pretty obvious that he has had an impact on writers to come after his work. The book titled Perspectives on Stephen King, written by Andrew J. Rosch, gives a list of many authors, filmmakers, and screenwriters that have all testified their respect for King and the influence he has had on them. Rosch lists names such as Richard Chismar, Robin Firth, Lee Gambin, Stephen J. Spignesi, and Stanley Whiter, all of which have established themselves either as an author or part of the film industry. Chismar, author of the Cemetery Dance magazine, stated on page 46, quote, "Without Stephen and his work, I am not sure I would have ever started writing again," end quote. Chismar is fascinated with King's book It and has taken inspiration from him for a long time. Lee Gambin, another credited author, states on page 66, quote, "Stephen King started out as a film thing for me, opposed to books. I was very lucky because I was allowed to watch whatever I wanted, which is great. I really got into horror," end quote, referring to the movie adaptation of King's works. The list mentioned in his books goes on, but many of them say the same things about how King was such an impact on their writing and how he has changed the horror genre. Along the same lines, it should also be mentioned that King has had an influence outside that of just authors. King's novels have been adapted into the movie screen many times, with plenty of them being huge successes. Since this isn't King's work directly, it fits more into the category of his inspiration on the directors of these films that sometimes take their own spin on King's stories. Some of the most recent being Vincenzo Natali, director of In the Tall Grass, Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Widmar, directors of Pet Sematary 2019, and Andreas Muschietti, director of It, Chapter 1 in 2017. Some of these adaptations aren't much of a success, but many of them are. King's work King's work has inspired these directors, but isn't always to King's delight. The most well-known example of King's is extreme. The most well-known example of this is King's extreme disapproval of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. This goes to show that King's novels can influence some people in different ways than others. Regardless of if King thinks it is a good or a bad thing, he has undeniably had a large impact on the horror genre and community, whether it be readers, filmmakers, moviegoers, or specifically authors. He has created a baseline that all creators can refer to if they want new ideas for horror when their wells run dry. While influencing many of today's horror authors, King's work will go down in history as some of the greatest and be read for many years to come for future fans of horror. His work grows in popularity day by day, and with new adaptations and books being released even to this day as he is 75 years old, his works will always be a part of the horror genre.